The cemetery on Victoria Island held its breath as white tents beat like slow wings and a golden casket hovered above wet cement, when a ragged man in a tattered brown coat broke the aisle and rewrote the morning with one sentence. Judith Anderson, the billionaire everyone had come to bury, was alive. Phones rose like a metal forest, gasps stitched the air. Even the pastor's Bible sagged in his hands as Benjamin Okoro planted himself at the bier and named the trick, a substance that cools the skin, slows the chest, fools the eye, then asked for one clean chance to prove it in public. He did not shout his pain, he aimed it. "Remove the cotton," he said softly to Judith's aunt. "Lift her shoulders a little, air first." To the mourners, "Touch her wrist, warmth is stubborn." To the room's authority, "Let evidence speak louder than grief." Williams, handsome in mourning and loud in command, snapped for the guards. Dr. David, collar damp, tried to smile a diagnosis back into certainty. The grave workers stepped away from the straps as the crowd, uninvited but suddenly essential, murmured for a check. Just check. When the aunt nodded, the spell of ceremony cracked. Benjamin folded his coat into a pillow, slid it under Judith's neck, and raised a small brown vial, his only valuable thing, so every camera could see it. Neutralizer. The word hung above the grave like a bridge. He asked for the smallest permission, one drop on a tongue that looked like sleep. He did not negotiate with William's fury or the doctor's authority. He negotiated with the room's instincts, the way a city remembers right and wrong in its bones. The wind cut through the tents, bracelets clinked. Someone whispered a prayer. "If it fails," a voice from the crowd called, "we bury. If it works, God help us." Benjamin leaned close, and the entire cemetery leaned with him, Lagos itself holding its breath inside a rectangle of canvas and grass. He counted under it, a low drum. 1, 2, 3. On 4, nothing. On 5, the tents sighed. On 6, the courage in his fingers wavered, and William surged, metal flashing, until 2 men in black suits formed a human gate, and the aunt's palm rose like a stop sign. Benjamin steadied, squeezed again, and the second drop fell through sunlight toward a mouth everyone had already said goodbye to. Before it landed, the hush cracked, so faint it could have been wind or memory. A cough tried the world. The drop touched. Judith's throat swallowed. Her lips parted. A breath, weak but undeniable, lifted and fell. The crowd detonated into sound, prayer, disbelief, a child's sharp cry, plastic chairs scraping grass. William's hand, suddenly unarmed of excuses, released a small syringe that clattered against concrete like a confession. Dr. David found the floor with his eyes and could not look up. The aunt's fingers shook on Judith's wrist and then steadied. Warm, she breathed, not to be dramatic, but because the truth had weight again. Benjamin did not claim the moment. He held it, palm under the back of a woman the city almost buried while awake. Judith's lashes trembled. A second cough, louder, owned, tore through the noise. Then came the question with teeth. Why? She looked at the man who had rehearsed grief and rushed burial, and found him suddenly smaller than his suit. Around them, authority remembered its job. Guards seized Williams as he raged about ground and ownership. The pastor finally prayed like a man astonished by his own words. A reporter wept into a microphone that did not care. What mattered now were the tokens the eye could trust, the clatter of a syringe, the heat in a wrist, a chest climbing from the edge, a witness who would not move. By the time sirens painted the tombstones red and blue, the story had already turned. No longer a neat ceremony, but a public reversal, the kind that asks a city to choose what to believe, when a husband's signature and a doctor's stamp collide with a living breath. Benjamin kept his voice even, as if speaking to a skittish animal. "Easy, madam, hold on." He had no title to stand on, only timing, conscience, and a vow he made under a bridge to never be late for the truth again. The tents shuttered, the grave waited without complaint, and the woman who refused to die sat, barely, on her own casket, while Lagos learned, again, that gossip is loud, but evidence is louder.
Chaos rolled through the cemetery like heat on tar, as Judith's second cough tore the shroud off certainty and turned mourners into witnesses, guards into referees, and Williams into a man suddenly smaller than his suit. Benjamin, steady as a metronome, braced her shoulders with one palm and kept his voice calm. "Easy, madam, breathe, because panic is loud, but recovery prefers whisper." And in that whisper the aunt felt again for life and found it rising stubbornly beneath her fingers. Phones hovered, catching the glint of the syringe that had clattered from William's hand to the concrete lip of the grave like a confession best heard by cameras. And Dr. David's eyes, trained to read pulses, now read only the crowd's judgment, his smile folding into the kind of sweat that stains reputations. "Back away," the aunt commanded, voice iron flat by love. And two grave workers, men hired to lower finalities, became midwives to a different ending, helping Benjamin prop Judith with the folded coat while he counted her breaths like chevrons on a road pulling her home. The pastor found his voice, fumbling at first, then steadier, as if Scripture itself had decided to witness. Thanksgiving, protection, truth. And the reporter at the edge of the tent spoke into her microphone with tears in her throat, knowing Lagos would believe her only because Lagos was already watching. Williams lunged once more, but the row of mourners in black formed a human gait, shoulders squared, eyes bright with a courage that surprises people about themselves. And the head of security, torn between employer and evidence, chose evidence. His hand rose, and his men pinned Williams just long enough for the blue-red wash of sirens to paint the marble stones with authority. The police didn't stride in, they measured in, cataloging the syringe, the vial, the casket's position, the way the cotton had been removed, the witnesses willing to write their names beneath what they had seen. And in the small pause between procedure and astonishment, Judith's eyes fluttered open like heavy doors testing their hinges. Her lips cracked on a single word, "Why?" And the question, shaped for Williams, passed through Dr. David first like a blade through cloth. He tugged at his collar, muttered about grief and mistakes, but the facts refused to blush for him. Benjamin asked for water. Someone ran. Someone prayed. The aunt fanned Judith's face with a funeral program that no longer matched the day's plot. When the paramedics arrived, Benjamin reported like a soldier. 2 drops, cough at first contact, improved chest rise, warm wrist, responsive to voice. And while they checked pupils and oxygen and placed a mask, the lead officer drew Williams aside and asked the questions people ask when the truth stands panting in public. Who ordered the certificate? Why the rush? Why the syringe? Williams tried one last performance, grieving widower grappling with chaos, but the mask slid, and in the gap, the officer glimpsed the man beneath, a calculus of greed and entitlement that had expected a grave to solve a problem. Dr. David attempted medical Latin. The paramedic answered with human English. "She's alive." A murmur spread, one of those sounds that roll across bodies and tents and grass like weather, and even the wind paused to listen. Benjamin did not bask. He scanned the scene the way men do when they have once lost everything and now understand how quickly miracles can be mislaid. And when Judith tried to rise, he pressed her gently back, promising, because promises are oxygen, that he would not move from her side. The stretcher slid under her with the ceremony of a coronation no one planned, and as the straps were buckled, the aunt turned to the officer and named what the city would call the case: attempted burial of a living woman, conspiracy between husband and physician, motive lined in zeros. Evidence bags sealed with crisp clicks that sounded like locks, and the crowd parted for the path to the waiting ambulance, filming, sobbing, whispering the kind of prayers that stitch neighborhoods together after dark. At the door, Judith searched for Benjamin's face and found it, bearded, tired, holy in a way that has nothing to do with altars. She lifted a hand, and he took it, and in that humble grip, 2 stories, her survival, his return, braided into one resilient rope. "Stay," she mouthed, and he nodded as if the word were an oath. Behind them, the pastor retrieved his fallen Bible and held it to his chest, not to quote, but to feel the weight of it. The security chief radioed for scene control. The reporter rehearsed a headline that would breathe on every screen by evening, and Williams, wrists cuffed, stared at the earth that had refused to keep his secret. When the ambulance doors thudded shut, Lagos exhaled into a new afternoon, already carrying the next chapter toward courtrooms and boardrooms and bridges where men once slept because a woman who refused to die had risen, and the city that almost buried her had remembered painfully and beautifully how to listen.
The hospital smelled like antiseptic and rain when the ambulance door swung open and delivered Judith into a corridor suddenly disciplined by urgency. Monitors blinked awake, nurses worked and practiced choreography, and a trauma physician, unmoved by the fame attached to the patient, focused on the stubborn mathematics of a pulse that had survived a grave. Benjamin followed as far as security allowed and stopped at a painted line on the floor, palms open, posture patient. He had learned to wait in places built for other people. The aunt anchored the family's presence with signatures and questions, while the paramedics handed over vitals, shallow respirations now steadying, pupils reactive, temperature rising from the unnatural cool of pretended death. In a bright room framed by lead glass, Judith's chest lifted beneath a blanket. Warm air from a nasal cannula inflated the silence with small proofs. Meanwhile, across town, Williams sat in an interview room whose fluorescent lights were designed to make certainty sweat. Cuffed wrists resting on a metal table, he tried on 3 performances: grief, offense, bewilderment, and each fit more poorly than the last. The lead investigator, a woman who had learned to interrogate with gravity rather than volume, laid out items that did not care for theater. The syringe in an evidence bag, the funeral video time-stamped to the cough, the doctor's certificate, the neutralizer's residue captured on swabs, the rush orders at the cemetery, the driver's statement about isolation at the hospital gate. She asked fewer questions than the room expected. She let objects ask them. In the next room, Dr. David clasped and unclasped his hands like a man trying to remember a prayer he once believed, his voice thin as he attempted to stitch protocol and probability and grief-stricken judgment into a blanket that might cover betrayal. The detective did not argue. She simply slid across the toxicology prelim, a diagram of tetrodotoxin's cruelty, a slow heartbeat, shallow breath, muscles taken hostage, and waited. In the hospital, a lab request traveled downstairs with a priority stamp, while the trauma physician ordered warmed IV fluids and cardiac monitoring, then dictated a note whose unembellished sentences sounded like a hymn to competence. Patient responsive to verbal stimuli, protective reflexes present, suspected exposure to paralytic agent, supportive care ongoing. The aunt exhaled a thank you she could not shape into language, and looked over her shoulder to find Benjamin still where he had promised to be. Reporters had already colonized the lobby like a field of microphones. A security rope translated curiosity into distance, and a spokesperson rehearsed the sentence that would soon be on every broadcast. Mrs. Anderson is alive, under observation, and stable. On social feeds, amateur sleuths framed, slowed, and looped the cough. Moralists found sermons, cynics found conspiracy. But in the clinical glow of Room 6B, biology kept a quieter rhythm, indifferent to hashtags. When the detective finally asked Williams about the syringe, he tried to fling the answer toward the doctor, toward grief, toward nonsense, anywhere but the spot where motive meets means. But his words clanged against the bag like thrown coins. In the doctor's room, silence worked harder than threat. Fear of prison wrestled with shame, with debt, with a career built on the illusion that competence and conscience are the same thing. A confession did not arrive. Confessions rarely do on cue. But a first fracture did. "I was pressured," he said to the table, and the stenographer's keys translated the tremor into text. Back at the hospital, Benjamin gave his statement to an officer who wrote diligently, surprised, though she didn't show it, by the precision of a man in frayed sleeves. Time he heard the conversation beneath the bridge, details of the car, the tone of command in Williams's voice, the instruction about a quick burial, the trembling in Dr. David's reply. She asked why he hadn't come sooner. He answered the only way a man with a complicated past can and still keep standing. "I came as fast as I could." Evening pressed its face to the windows. Lagos's traffic laced the horizon with red threads. In Judith's room, a monitor declared progress in soft beeps. The aunt rested her head briefly on Benjamin's shoulder, and he did not move, because constancy is sometimes the only luxury the poor can afford. When the trauma physician returned with the first lab confirmations, relief entered the room wearing a white coat. The drug was there, in a dose calculated to mimic death and guarantee silence, and its detection would survive any clever defense. The detective's phone buzzed with the update just as she closed Williams's file for the night. Cases like this, she knew, are won on the first day by choices about what to secure and what to doubt. She chose to secure everything. Outside, the city calibrated its outrage and its awe. Inside, the woman who had refused to die slept properly for the first time since the quiet poison learned her name. And the man who had stopped her burial kept watch with a patience that looked very much like love and did not yet know its next assignment.
The court convened under a pewter sky, and inside the high room with its varnished benches and bright crests, the hush felt like a held breath as State v. Williams Anderson and Dr. David Ofori was called. Judith entered on her own feet and sat beside her aunt while Benjamin chose the row just behind, close enough to steady without overshadowing. The judge, silver-haired and unsentimental, surveyed the crowd until side conversations folded into silence, then nodded to the prosecutor, who opened a thin file that landed like iron. A syringe in a sealed bag, toxicology notes, a funeral video where a cough cracked a city's heart, an ambulance report, a rushed certificate signed in ink that still felt wet. He spoke without theater. Motive in an empire's promise, means in a paralytic posing as death, opportunity in a husband's access and a doctor's gate at midnight. William sat in the dock like a portrait of denial. Dr. David folded into himself, hands clasped, lips rehearsing explanations. Asked to plead, both said, "Not guilty," the sound scraping along the benches like a chair on tile. Chick, the driver, testified first, careful with truth. The hospital gate, the order to leave, the hours of exile, the neat announcement of death that did not fit.
Then the toxicologist taught without condescension, tetradotocin in measured whisper, how a wrist can lie, how breath can hide, and how only suspicion and careful method rescue the living from polite burial. Charts glowed, technical syllables became plain speech. The judge wrote notes in a narrow hand. When the prosecutor raised the evidence bag, the overhead lights turned the syringe into a small, indifferent star. Cross-examination arrived with tidy aggression. The defense floated mist, equipment error, grief-clouded observation, a madman's interference, and the expert dispelled each, replacing fog with weather. The room pivoted when Benjamin was called. He rose in a thrift store suit, pressed into respectability, and swore the oath in a voice the court could sit in. He did not make himself tragic, he made himself useful. He told the bridge story. The idling car, the talk of quick burial, the threat of ruin, the doctor's frightened assent. He told the cemetery story. The aunt's courage, the dropper, the cough like history correcting itself. The defense tried to sand his credibility with poverty, where he slept, what he drank, who might have paid him. He answered with details, times, street names, and a dignity that cannot be counterfeited. Judith did not look away. Each answer stitched something back inside her that the grave had unpicked. Finally, the prosecutor faced Williams with the bagged syringe between them like a mirror. Had he seen it? Why the haste? Why a certificate before a second physician? His replies came smooth, then thin. Temper flashed and was tucked back, like a knife glimpsed and sheathed. The judge's gavel discouraged theater. Truth would be weighed, not performed. Dr. David's turn brought a tremor. Under oath, he tried to braid cowardice into caution, but the braid unraveled when the timeline appeared. Isolation at the gate, refusal of consultation, ink drying faster than the body cooled. A hush passed through the gallery like a single creature breathing. Outside, cameras rehearsed conclusions. Inside, the judge asked what mattered. Where did medicine end and conspiracy begin? The room felt the floor tilt. The aunt dabbed her eyes and sat taller. Benjamin, hands folded, kept still as a trellis. The judge announced a recess. In the aisle, Judith's knees trembled and Benjamin reached her in 2 steps, offering an arm that remembered graveside weight. She took it, not as a damsel, but as a general accepting a banner from a loyal scout. Williams watched, mouth a hard line, and Dr. David stared at his shoes. When the clock resumed and the court reassembled, everyone understood the geometry had changed. The case no longer circled doubt, it orbited proof, and proof, once it finds its center, pulls everything toward judgment. In that renewed order, the prosecutor's outline looked less like accusation and more like a map. Jurors glanced with recognition that stories have gravity, and this one, anchored by breath, evidence, and witness, drew them toward a verdict no rhetoric could evade.
The 5th morning broke with the kind of courthouse weather that makes tempers brittle. Flat light, low clouds, a breeze that toyed with files as if justice were paper. And inside, the prosecutor arose with a calm that signaled endings, not arguments. He lined the day with certainties. The chain of custody intact from graveside to lab. The funeral footage slowed to the precise frame of Judith's first breath. The ambulance record, the toxicology report that named tetradotocin without stutter, the hospital gate log that timed Dr. David's isolation, and the driver chick's unshaken account that fit the timeline like a key. He called the toxicologist again only to tighten screws. Dosage ranges that mimicked death without causing it, expected skin temperature, pupil response under penlight. The margin for error so slim that only malice or negligence would rush a burial. Then he rested, and the room felt that word land, rested, as if a machine had powered down to reveal the shape of what it had built. Cross-examination tried fog, contamination, calibration drift, grief as a hallucinogen, but the expert answered with calibration logs, blank controls, and the ordinary heroism of procedures done properly. When the doctor returned to the stand, his voice carried the fatigue of a man who had argued with himself all night and lost. He spoke of pressure without naming its author, of clinical impressions consistent with death, of a rare presentation, but the prosecutor set a single photograph between them, the syringe on concrete by the grave, its barrel filmed with the same residue the lab had found in the vial, and then asked the small question that makes large rooms tinny. Why had a certificate been signed before an independent confirmation? Dr. David's mouth shaped an answer and found none that could stand. The judge's pen paused, and in that small stillness, the gallery felt the floor of the case harden. Called upon, Williams tried a performance he had rehearsed since childhood, wounded dignity, and for the first 30 seconds it almost held. He loved his wife. He suffered under rumors. He grieved in a city that eats grief for content. But truth is patient, and the prosecutor let him keep talking, let him sharpen his own edges until they drew blood. Why the rush orders at the cemetery? Why the argument overheard in a parked car about quick burial? Why threaten a doctor if death were natural and inevitable? Williams's answers slid around the questions like oil on glass, then thinned, then cracked. A flash of temper surfaced, the same flash the camera had caught when the syringe slipped from his hand. And it was enough. Juries do not need melodrama when they already have evidence. They need confirmation that the mask and the face are the same person. From the second row, Judith sat unblinking, a survivor learning what attempted erasure sounds like when it is forced to use indoor voices. Benjamin, a row behind, anchored silence the way a pillar anchors a roof. Rebuttal was brief. The paramedic who had first said, "She's alive," recounted vital signs with a steadiness that made the words feel newly miraculous. The cemetery security chief explained choosing evidence over employer in a tone free of heroics. The aunt permitted one limited clarification, described the warmth's return to her wrist, and stopped before the court turned her love into spectacle. And then the prosecutor closed, not with fire, but with weight. Empire as motive, paralytic as means, access as opportunity, and above all, breath. One undeniable breath reclaiming a body the defendants had tried to transfer from asset to absence. He reminded the court that medicine demands doubt in the face of uncertainty, not signatures, and that love, when real, delays burial rather than hurrying it. The defense's closing came dressed in eloquence and indignation, but words could not dislodge the fixed points: syringe, residue, video, lab, timeline. And as the judge read instructions and the jury filed out, the room inhaled the particular quiet that follows arithmetic once it has finished counting. It did not take a day. It barely took an hour. When the jurors returned, their faces wore the careful blankness of people about to make history ordinary. The foreperson stood, verdict sheets crisp in hand, and read what the evidence had been reading all along. Guilty of attempted murder and conspiracy for Williams Anderson. Guilty of conspiracy and professional malpractice for Dr. David Affery. The judge thanked the jury, then turned the bench into a threshold. Sentence would be pronounced tomorrow, she said, but tonight Lagos would sleep with a different story in its mouth, that a breath is louder than a lie, that a city can witness and not look away, and that a man with nothing can hold a line where wealth tried to erase it. Judith's fingers found Benjamin's on the bench between them,
No theater, just contact. And across the aisle, William stared at a future shrinking to the size of a cell, while Dr. David stared at his hands as if they had just now told him what they had done. Sentencing day dawned with a clear, almost indecent brightness, as if the sky had chosen not to mirror the gravity inside courtroom 3. And when the judge returned to the bench, the murmurs folded into a silence that could carry weight. She read the impact statement first, Judith's measured account of being escorted to the edge of oblivion by the two men she had financed, trusted, and fed. And the words, unembellished, moved through the room like slow thunder. Businesses paused, families waited, a city learned how greed can dress itself in tuxedos and white coats. William stood rigid, jaw set in a mask that had already been unmade by evidence. Dr. David hunched smaller than his lab coat could ever have made him, fingers worrying the seam of a handkerchief as if suturing air. The law concluded what the facts had been insisting. Life imprisonment with hard labor for Williams, life for Dr. David with permanent revocation of license, and a few spoken sentences that landed like chisels. This court is not merely a ledger for punishment. It is a door that protects the living. Cameras caught the flinch, the bracelets, the final look Williams flung toward Judith, a glare that mistook volume for power. She did not return it. Outside, Lagos inhaled a verdict it had both expected and still needed to hear. But Judith did not linger by microphones. She went home to a house that had smelled of lilies and night sweats, and in the late afternoon she invited Benjamin to her study, that mahogany harbor where decisions were heavier than furniture. He came quietly, washed and pressed, but carrying the honest scuffs of a life that had not always let him choose. He stood until she gestured to the chair opposite. What followed was not spectacle, but surgery without anesthesia. He told the story he had spared the courtroom, the job lost in a collapse not entirely his fault, the wife who left a note that detonated paternity, the weeks that bled into years under bridges where the city's noise cannot drown the loneliness, and the vow he had made to the shadows that if ever he heard the sound of another burial being hurried, he would run toward it regardless of who called him mad. Judith listened with the kind of attention that powerful people sometimes forget they owe the world. When he reached for air midway, she poured water, and did not interrupt the dignity of his halting. "You gave me back my breath," she said at last, fingers laced, voice calm. "So I will not let the world take yours again." The next morning she began keeping that promise not with charity, but with trust. Small tasks at Anderson Holdings that looked like errands, but were really reconnaissance missions for competence. He carried files, yes, but he also noticed the logic behind their labeling, the bottlenecks of approval, the soft leaks where urgency dissolved into excuse. During a board meeting, when a corrupted deck froze the room into panic and threatened a 7-figure deal, Benjamin asked for 5 minutes and a laptop, then coaxed the presentation back from its digital coma and rethreaded the slides as if stitching a wound. The relief in that glass conference room sounded like a summer shower on a tin roof. Skeptical directors developed the decency to be curious. Judith developed the courage to be explicit. "This is Benjamin Okoro," she said in a voice that traveled the table, "my special advisor on systems and integrity." Titles can feel like scaffolding or chains. For Benjamin, the words felt like a brace set gently on a long-healed fracture, allowing the leg to bear weight again. He learned names the building had forgotten to respect, the receptionist with a map of the office in her head, the night cleaner who understood the heartbeat of the servers, the young analyst whose spreadsheets told truths faster than memos, and he built a quiet alliance of competence that made the whole machine less noisy and more honest. In the evenings, Judith sometimes found him on the balcony outside the study, looking past the gardens toward the bruised blue ribbon of the Atlantic. They would talk, not always about the trial, often about ordinary mercies, good coffee, repaired elevators, payroll on time, and sometimes about the stubbornness of hope. She noticed the way he deferred credit like a man allergic to praise. He noticed the way she remembered first names across departments, like a woman who had once needed others to remember hers at a gravesite. The city kept buzzing, with think pieces about wealth and witness, with podcasts turning the story into digestible outrage. But inside the house and at the company, something quieter took root. Not romance, not yet, but a trust capable of outliving headlines. On a Sunday afternoon, the aunt arrived with Jolliffe and counsel, blessing the study with laughter and the air with spice. And as the three of them ate at the long table once draped in condolence wreaths, Judith looked at Benjamin and said simply, "You're home." He lowered his eyes to hide the wetness there, but gratitude has a way of shining through the cracks. And though he still slept lightly, like a man expecting to be moved on, he began to dream in complete sentences again, the kind that leave room for tomorrow.
The months that followed did not unfold like a fairy tale, so much as a careful garden, tended one ordinary day at a time. And in that steady season, Judith found herself watching Benjamin the way one watches dawn, not for spectacle, but for proof that light returns. She admired his ease with people who rarely make agendas, the receptionists and drivers and cleaners whose names he remembered without effort. And she felt a warmth she refused to name because it respected neither grief's residue nor gratitude's boundary. He never strutted in the corridors, never turned the miracle at the grave into currency. He simply kept showing up with a notebook, a quiet question, a better way to route approvals, a habit of crediting other people first. When her board's cynics softened into collaborators, when a long-stalled procurement finally moved without grease, when an analyst's shy insight made a meeting smarter, Judith noticed that the center of gravity had shifted toward decency and away from fear. And somewhere in that shift, her heart tugged toward him, slowly, inconveniently, honestly. She said nothing. Leadership had taught her that confessing a feeling can sometimes sabotage a good thing, and she feared the disrespect of confusing a man's rescue with a man's destiny. Then one evening on the balcony, with the ocean laying its slow pulse against the horizon, Benjamin spoke with a hesitance she had not seen since the day he told his bridge story. "There's someone I'd like you to meet," he said, and the sentence was both invitation and mercy. Juliana arrived 2 days later carrying mangoes and an unhurried smile. She had teacher's hands and market day humor, and when she shook Judith's hand, her eyes said plainly, "I see you beyond the headlines." Over dinner, Juliana asked about operations rather than gossip, laughed at Benjamin's self-deprecation, and teased him with the harmless accuracy of someone who had studied his stubbornness up close. Judith felt the ache announce itself and then recede like a tide obeying the moon. She made a choice, blessing over bitterness, and by dessert the choice had ripened into ease. Weeks slipped by and the trio became a small, cheerful constellation. When Benjamin leaned toward Juliana in the study and forgot his careful distance by a hair, Judith watched tenderness land exactly where it should and let relief braid itself with the thinner thread of loss into something surprisingly strong. The day Benjamin asked your opinion on a ring, she did not flinch. Instead, she called her jeweler and insisted on modest excellence. The proposal was simple, in a small garden that had once hosted grief's flowers. Juliana said yes through tears that rinsed old disappointments off both their faces. And the wedding that followed was a lesson in proportion. White roses, golden drapes, a navy suit that fit Benjamin like a men's. Vows spoken in voices that had done the work of becoming true. Judith paid vendors on time, archived every receipt, and stood in the front row clapping like a woman whose joy had no hidden agenda. That night, After the last song folded into silence, she stood alone under a string of lights and let herself cry for 3 minutes. Not for loss, she realized as the tears cooled, but for the ending of a wish that would have stolen someone else's beginning. Life, as if grateful for her honesty, answered with an unforeseen echo. At a charity gala for community clinics, Judith met George, a man whose success wore no noise, whose handshake was unhurried, whose first question was about her aunt's blood pressure readings, and whose second was about payroll reliability for nurses. He did not audition for a plot. He asked for coffee. Coffee became evening walks along water, the kind that do not require performing for each other. Judith discovered how much laughter had been quarantined during the trial, and George released it from custody without fanfare. He saw the woman who had sat on her own casket and chosen life, not the brand that anchored a skyline, and in seeing her, he made room for rest to be brave. Months later, when he knelt with a ring at the exact spot on the balcony where Benjamin had once said, "There's someone," Judith answered yes, with a calm that startled happiness into something durable. At her wedding, Benjamin and Juliana sat in the front row as promised, their applause bright and unjealous. The aunt cried exactly as much as an aunt is allowed, then reverted to logistics. And the city that had watched a resurrection learned to watch a second chance that did not need headlines. By the time the newlyweds returned from a brief, quiet escape up the coast, Anderson Holdings was humming with the kind of order that talent mistakes for magic and discipline recognizes as love. In late evenings, it was not uncommon to find Benjamin and Judith and their spouses in the study, shoes off, laughter spilling, the air carrying spice from the aunt's kitchen. If Judith's gaze ever lingered on the man who once refused to let her be buried, it lingered now with gratitude unmarbled by longing. The story had declined melodrama for maturity, and maturity, it turned out, was its own form of wonder.
The year that followed bent toward gentleness like a branch relieved of storm, and in that soft arc 2 cradles appeared where a casket once dominated the story. Benjamin and Juliana welcomed a son they named Jonathan, a name that sounded like loyalty made flesh, while Judith and George received a daughter, Eliana, whose first cry seemed to sign a peace treaty with the past. On a gold-shouldered evening, they gathered in the mansion garden with the aunt's stew steaming on a long table and raised glasses above sleeping infants to a simple toast, from ashes to dawn, and for a moment the air itself felt repaired. Yet the past did not vanish. It learned to knock instead of haunt. In prison, Williams withered into a man who finally believed mirrors and filled notebook after notebook with letters he had no right to expect anyone to read. For years, Judith let the envelope stack in a drawer like unpaid debts, until one slow afternoon she broke the seal on a sentence that did not flatter him or plead innocence, only regret written without adjectives. She read more, steadily, the way one climbs a hill for the view rather than the exercise, and found a man taking inventory of his ruin, how greed confuses respect with ownership, how entitlement needs speed to outrun conscience, how love cannot be extorted even with a death certificate. Forgiveness did not arrive as sentiment, it arrived as discipline. On the 10th anniversary of the day Breath disproved paperwork, Judith walked onto a stage at a foundation gala, flanked by George's quiet strength and Benjamin's untheatrical presence, and said what she had rehearsed alone 100 times. "If survival means anything, it is that I will not keep dying from the same wound. I forgive Williams Anderson." The hall stumbled over its own gasp. Some applauded as if a dam had opened, others muttered about precedent, but Judith did not offer her forgiveness as a pardon for consequences, only as a release from custody of the heart. Weeks later, a parole board blinked at a country that had learned new grammar for justice, and Williams stepped into sunlight he did not think he would see again, carrying plastic bags and the weight of a life he could no longer pilot. He rented a small room where the wallpaper curled like old decisions, and watched Judith on television sometimes, whispering apologies to no one, because apologies, at last, were all he had. Lagos moved on, as cities must, but the story did not become content, it became culture. At Anderson Holdings, Benjamin's quiet coalition of competence matured into a code. Pay on time, escalate early, document truly, tell bad news fast. And the company grew not by emblazoning miracles on billboards, but by refusing shortcuts that smell like graves. On Saturdays, the garden that once hosted shock now hosted small rituals. Toddlers trading toys under adult negotiation. The aunt telling proverbs while trimming roses. George and Benjamin disputing football like men who practice disagreement without contempt. And Judith, barefoot in the grass, learning the sound of her daughter's laughter as if it were a new instrument. Occasionally, she would watch Benjamin lift Jonathan and think how rescue, in its truest form, is not a transaction, but a seed that keeps choosing to become a tree. When memories darkened, they were handled rather than buried. Judith visited the bridge with Benjamin one dawn and left a parcel, blankets, warm food, a card with a number that actually answered, and they drove away in a silence that felt like two prayers, separately worded, jointly heard. The city made its adaptations too. The cemetery adopted a protocol requiring independent confirmation before burial. Hospitals circulated memos about paralytic imposters. A medical board published a plain language guide titled "Doubt Saves Lives." And somewhere, a young doctor paused before signing and asked for another pair of eyes because she had watched this case and learned humility. In time, the headlines yielded to harvests. Jonathan's first steps plotted a zigzag across the same patio where Benjamin once steadied a failing presentation. Eliana pressed a seashell to Judith's ear and insisted it was the ocean, saying, "Stay." Judith led a literacy circle for staff children in the atrium on Thursdays. The aunt, unretired from wisdom, declared that miracles are loud for a day and then spend years proving themselves in chores. And when night laid its velvet over the compound, Judith and Benjamin sometimes sat at the balcony rail with their spouses and let the city's glow salt the horizon. They did not relitigate pain, they curated promise. The question that had once crackled from a throat resurrecting, why, was no longer a prosecution. It was a teacher. Why survive? To practice mercy without losing memory. Why forgive? To prevent grief from inheriting the deed to your future. Why love again? Because breath, once returned, expects employment. And as the children slept and the adults traded stories that did not need cameras, the story settled into its final shape, not a legend about a billionaire undone and remade, not a parable about a beggar made advisor, but a communal vow spoken without microphones. We will check the pulse. We will slow the rush, we will choose the living thing, and when dawn comes, as it often does after a faithful night, we will be found ready.